Hello and welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking Cenarion minis, and we're going to be talking Warcraft Rumble. So this is one of my favorite mobile games right now. I really enjoy the tower pushing of it. I'm using the site NAF to look at all the minis. I have the minis on the side. There's like 100 gajillion ads going on, so I'm not going to record the actual minis. That's why I read them off to you guys. But we're going to start with the leaders like normal, and we're going to talk spells, and then we'll talk units. I really like the Cenarion faction. I hope that they get some more support minis. I've done a couple videos talking about how to improve them and minis that I would like to see. So you guys should definitely go check those out if you're interested in seeing what my opinions are on those minis. Anyways, let's jump into it, starting with the leaders. We're going to start with Uno, then do Cenarius, and then do Ysara. I believe that's the way that they're located in the game. So Uno is a ancient of lore, and he's essentially a moving base. Like, you can summon around him. He has a summon area around him. That's his special ability. And he's kind of a tank, but he takes double damage from elemental. And that's pretty much all you need to know about him. He does block enemy deployment as well. Anyways, his talents are Petrify, which is on death. He keeps his safe harbor ability for 8 seconds. That's my favorite one to use. I think that's very strong. Another one that's well liked is called From the Trees, which is when you deploy minis in there within his safe harbor area, they will deal double damage on their first attack. That's also very strong. Both of them have niche usage for Uno in that situation. And then you have Barkskin, which is minis deployed with Safe Harbor Grant Armor for 8 seconds. Honestly, that one's not very good. There's better ways to gain permanent armor if you really need to. So I'm not a big fan of the Barkskin. But the other two, I think, have their uses. So next we're going to jump into Cenarius. Also, before I move on, let me actually talk about Uno a little bit more. He's 6 gold. Unfortunately, 6 gold for most leaders is just too expensive in my opinion. When you hit 6 gold, they have to be extremely good at what they do. There are niche reasons to use Uno, but generally, he's just not good enough for the cost, in my opinion. I would rather use Ysara or Cenarius. Anyways, we're going to jump into Cenarius next. He deals elemental damage. He has Tranquility, which is a big circle around him of green that just heals over time, like randomly all minis inside of it. He also roots enemies that touch it. Enemy ground units that touch the circle become rooted for 3 seconds. He is resistant, so he takes less damage from elemental damage. And he can, obviously, with his Tranquility, he heals. He provides his team with 20% empty health if they're Cenarion allies, which is pretty decent. I wish it was for every unit. I'd rather have like 10% and it affects everything than just Cenarius units, because they're just not good enough ones yet to really warrant that. But it is a nice ability nonetheless. I mean, it's just 20% more health that you have to heal up. But normally if you drop him and then you drop a mini with him in the back of the base, it will heal before he engages the enemy. So for talents, he has Force of Nature, which summons a treant when a rooted enemy dies. So this works well with like the Dryad, things that are able to eliminate targets quickly that are with Cenarius, because then they'll get rooted by his thing, and then if they die within the 3 seconds, they also become treants. But Dryad's a more surefire way of getting it. You can also use the Earth and Moon spell, which we'll talk about in a minute here. That when it goes to Earth, it will do a rooting spell, and it's very strong and works well with Cenarius. But yes, that's probably the best talent because it summons additional minis, which is always helpful. And the other two are not fantastic. So Revitalize is allies entry Tranquility trigger an additional healing pulse. That's okay in certain situations. If you're trying to get more healing out, it's useful, but it's just generally not going to be as good as the Force of Nature. But it does have its use, so I'm not going to say it's bad by any means. It was the second talent that I picked. The other talent, which is Wild Growth, is on deploy. It roots all enemies for 5 seconds. That one to me isn't that helpful because you're not going to get anything from rooting those enemies, like because the talent to turn them into treants does not exist. So yeah, that's kind of how I feel about the Wild Growth, but Force of Nature, summoning treants on Rooted Death is pretty good, and then Revitalize. If you don't have a good amount of entangling minis, Revitalize is probably your better option. So next we're going to talk about Ysara. It's a very interesting mini, so you don't get to use Ysara directly. She is... essentially, when you get her in rotation, it's spells. She has a spell that, essentially, she has a spell that puts everybody to sleep, that you drop the spell in, that costs 3 gold. Everything costs 3 gold for her. You have a spell that gives you 4 gold over 10 seconds, so it essentially just increases your gold rate. You're spending 3 to get 4 back within 10 seconds. It's a nice way to cycle without having to use a mini. Like, you're essentially going to get the gold back. It's like you're paying for something now to get it later, essentially. And then you have 2 troops, which are Dragon Whelplings, that is like similar to the egg, except you have to drop them in a point, so they lose the Unbound, which makes them a little weaker. But they do gain poison stacking, which is very strong. But they die easily, so you have to make sure they're defended. And then you have the Emerald Drake, which is essentially the same thing as the regular Drake we talked about with the Blackrock Mountain faction, except it gains poison during its breath. So it's a little bit stronger, and it's actually only 3 cost, which makes it extremely good. Everything that she has is useful, though. Like, every spell that I just talked about and every mini that she has is playable. You can't play Ysara herself. She's essentially summoning minis that you use to play for her. Anyways, so that's pretty much what her ability is that she has all these different abilities. And they're all pretty solid. For Recurring Dream, which is her first talent, Ysari minis are twice as likely to show up in your hand. That's probably her strongest talent. It's the most, like, it guarantees you her minis. Her minis are relatively cheap and allows you to cycle your hand quicker, so they're nice to have. You also have Corrupted Dream, where you have Emerald Whelps and Emerald Drakes apply twice as much poison. That's usable in certain situations. And then you have Shared Dream, which is Hibernate, applies to all enemies on the board, which is probably the weakest, but it does have useful, like, it can be useful to play it. So it's a very interesting talent. Like, all the talents that she has are good. I would say Recurring Dream, which is you are twice as likely to see the minis in your hand, is probably the strongest. But the other 2 aren't bad, but they have, like, niche uses. They're not bad, but they're niche. So you're going to use them in certain fights that you might need to stack poison on, or in certain things where you might want to sleep the map to actually do a better push. I could see quite a few raid bosses that being decent on, to be honest. Won't know until I'm able to scale her up and actually give them a go, though. So next we're going to talk about spells. We have Earth and Moon here. We're done with the leaders. Out of the leaders, just so you guys know, Ysera is my favorite, and then probably Cenarius is my backup. I do like Cenarius. The issue is he's 5 gold. He is worth 5 gold, but I'd like him if he was 4. It's pretty much every leader that, like here, like, he should be 5, he should probably be 4. He's actually worth the gold, though, I will say that, whereas I don't feel like Uno's generally worth the gold. Ysara is great. I think she's probably the best leader right now. If you want healing, Cenarius is fine. His heal's just very weak. If you pair him with Frostbolt Shaman, it does help, but I feel like Tyrion does a better job healing than Cenarius does. Anyways, continuing to Earth and Moon. So what Earth and Moon does is every time you drop a Cenarion mini, it switches to either the stars here, that you can see on there, or it changes to the roots that you can see on the bottom of the little icon, which they're 2 different spells, more or less. It deals elemental damage or poison damage, depending on which one you're using. Moon is elemental, Earth is poison. So the two traits you can get with it is Nature's Grace. Entangling Roots also grants all allies resistance for 6 seconds. That's decent. You have Moon Fury, which is my favorite, which is Starfall lasts 25% longer. Starfall does deal a lot of damage and has a relatively big area, so I think Moon Fury is pretty good. I can understand Nature's Grace being useful as well, though, because resistance for 6 seconds can be useful. It's also going to hold enemies in place, which is always a solid little bonus that you get. Last but not least is Balance, which it can be cast a second time. Most of the time, very not useful. So it probably is the least, to be honest with you guys. So Moon Fury is probably, it depends on what you're trying to do, but either Moon Fury or Nature's Grace is probably your choice. Depends which form you're going to be using, really. Ancient of War is our next mini. We're going to talk about all of the minis now that are not spells or leaders and say where I put them. And we're going to start with Ancient of War. So Ancient of War is a 1 through 10 cost mini. It will take all the gold that you have to drop it and becomes a different level of power per the gold that you spend. He does have armored as well, so he's a nice little tank. That being said, Ancient of War is actually one of my favorite minis from from the Cenarion faction, even though I don't think he's that good. It's because he's one of the cheapest minis right now. Most of the minis have a decent cost on them, and if you have to put a mini in your deck from the faction, Ancient of War isn't bad because you can drop him for like 1 gold. He's armored. He'll take a few hits and probably block something that's going to be more valuable. So essentially it just allows you to cycle through your deck. Anyways, his talents are Lightning Rod. If played for 4 or more gold, it redirects an enemy spell and Unbound deploys to the Ancient of War's location. This is actually extremely good, but you need to play him for 4 or more gold. This is very much a PvP talent choice. It is good in PvE as well, but people tend to like it. You also have, if played for 6 gold, which is called Behemoth, he gains Sage damage. The issue with this talent is that you might as well just put a Molten Giant in your deck, because for 6 gold, he is better than the Ancient of War. You also then have Sapling, which is if you play it for 4 gold or less, he gains 60% attack speed. I tend to use Sapling or Lightning Rod, and most of the time I play Sapling because I use Ancient of War more for a cycle mini than I do to actually play the Ancient of War. He's like a little tank that I drop, and then I use him to tank a little bit before he dies for the rest of my minions to set up a board. You have Bog Beast next. I actually like Bog Beast. He's a high health tank who costs 3 gold. He's resistant out the gate, so he reduces elemental damage. He has a good amount of health. He has some decent talents. One of his talents is called Flourish. It heals are received are 30% more effective. This makes him very nice with the Shaman and with Cenarius. If you can get all 3 together, he can actually survive quite a bit. So it's a pretty solid talent. I would say that's probably the best talent. The other talents that he has is Rampant Growth, which is on death. He roots all nearby enemies for 6 seconds. That one's pretty good as well because it is a control talent. When he dies, you root everything to the ground, and it just gives you control of the playing field. The last one is Living Wood, and he gains armor at 50% health. He gains armor until he hits 50% health, and then he loses armored, which is a weird talent. That's probably the weakest simply because you can just put Frostwolf Shaman with him and she'll give him permanent armored, and then he has armored and resistant and a healer. And if you have Flourish, it's just a bonus. So Flourish is probably the strongest. Rampant Growth is probably your secondary talent, and then Living Wood would be your last choice. Living Wood's only useful if you do not have the Frostwolf Shaman, or you're not going to use it for some odd reason. Next up is the Dryad. She is a good unit. I did a video on her. I recommend people go watch it, like what they should have done with her, because I feel like they missed opportunities with her. Her talents are pretty poor. Her as a character overall isn't bad, though. So she's a 4-cost mini. She moves fast. She has poison damage, and she roots the enemy for, oh my god, what? 1.2 seconds or something like that. It's a little bit slower than I think her attack or something like that, or longer. I can't remember. Anyway, she has Barrage, which every time she can, she'll target something new. Not a big fan of Barrage. Normally you want to just target one unit down with her. It's very rare that you want to spread your damage about. Next talent is Nature Swiftness, which is probably the most useful talent she has, which is it grants movement speed to an ally. Essentially, it's a buff to an ally's movement speed. Gives them a fast trait. And then you have Thorns on her, which for her last talent, which is she deals damage back to melee attackers, and the damage increases up to 10 stacks. She's not tanky, though, so essentially you're just getting that to deal some damage to a melee attacker before she dies. It's a weird talent to give her. It would be actually been more interesting had they made like her give Thorns to a target, similar to Nature Swiftness, and then gave her something else in Nature Swiftness's place. Anyways, that's my thoughts on the Dryad. I think she was a missed opportunity. I feel like the other two talents, Thorns and Barrage, aren't that useful. And I feel like you're pretty much going to pick Nature Swiftness most of the time, even though even that can be not useful in most cases. Next we're going to talk about the Fairy Dragon, and then finally the Moonkin. So the Fairy Dragon is the flying unit from Cenarion faction that you can get without using Ysara. It's resistant. It can detect stealth units, so it can kill like bandits. Take out bandits is a good example, or the Worgen. It's immune to poison, burns, stuns, and slowing effects. But it's a relatively fragile unit, and it has low range. The talents for it are Fey Blessing, which is once per deploy, grants resist to a nearby ally. Probably the best talent. It gives resistance to something. Less useful than armor, surprisingly, I would say, simply because the Fairy Dragon doesn't heal. If the Fairy Dragon had some sort of heal and then gave Fey Blessing, it probably would have been an interesting mini, to be honest, having a flying healing mini. We don't have one yet. So that would have been something interesting that they probably could have did with it. Gave it like a weak single target heal. It would have been interesting, and to slow its speed down to kind of keep it behind your army. Probably would have made the Fairy Dragon a little bit better. But I'm going off on a tangent now. So Fey's Blessing is probably the best. It gives resist once per deploy. Can be used well on tanks. The other talents are Invisibility, which gains Stealth, which it has its uses. Stealth isn't bad. Having Stealth is very good. It's a nice backup talent to Resistance. And then Phase Shift, which is it teleports backwards when attacked. Generally not useful. Because of the speed of the Fairy Dragon, it's pretty quick. It's probably going to get ahead of your units anyway, so Phase Shift aren't going to really help. Finally, we have the Moonkin, who is the weirdest unit they could have made. So it has Armored, and it has a single target attack, and then a AoE attack. The issue with the Moonkin is it doesn't do either one very good, and its cost is very expensive. That's why they gave it Armored, to try to make it better. It doesn't really help. Anyways, the talents for it are mediocre as well. Probably the best one is Vengeance, where when it takes damage, it increases casting speed by 50% for 5 seconds. You also have Moonglow, which spells gain 2 levels if played immediately after Moonkin, which you can do some interesting things with that in like a Jaina deck. You drop Jaina, drop a spell, drop the Moonkin, drop a spell. But that's really the only time you would probably use the Moonglow. And then you have Typhoon, which is on deploy, knocks back nearby enemies, which again has its uses. You might use it with Uno, drop him next to Uno, knock some minions off of Uno, maybe throw a tank down so they get thrown into a tank. But yeah, that's pretty much the Moonkin. I don't have too many good things to say about him. I use him if I have to, but he's not one of my choice minis. Normally I go with Ancient of War, Bog Beast, Dryad, or Fairy Dragon if I have to pick a unit. Normally, Ancient of War and Dryad are my favorite, because Dryad does have some control abilities, and Ancient of War is just cheap. And I don't normally pick Bog Beast, because normally I have Fire Elemental as my tank in most decks, and he's just redundant at that point. And then Fairy Dragon, unless I need to make something resistant, I don't really use it. Anywho, that's the Cenarion minions. I hope that helps you guys, like, kind of with my thoughts on each of them, how to use them. It helps you in your gameplay a little bit. I do like the faction. I just think they need to... Some people don't like the shifting effect. I don't mind it. I think there's ways to do it in the future, but you need more minis to make shifting effects work. You can't be shifting spells around and things in your hand when you don't have cheap cycle minis. They need a couple cheap cycle minis is really what they need on top of Ysara, because if you don't have Ysara, this is, in my opinion, a little hard to use. They really should make cycle minis next. That's what their focus should be for the Cenarion faction, is thinking about 1 or 2 cheap cost minis that they can add to this faction, because that will make them a lot better. Even potentially making shifting low-cost minis would be interesting as well. They could also reduce the cost of Moon to 5. I think that would probably make it better, to be honest. I think 3 and 5 would probably be a better price point for Earth and Moon. Anywho, I hope that helps you guys. I hope my thoughts are intriguing to you, if nothing else. And I will catch you in the final and last video on minis, which will be on the Beast minis. I'll catch you guys there. Later.